Welcome everyone to this next seminar in the series, Transforming Constraints into Opportunities, Re-envisioning Medical Education.
Okay.
And the focus of this session will be to implement a flipped classroom approach. I'm Dr. Peter Horneffer, the Executive Dean at the All-American Institute for Medical Sciences in Jamaica, and hence my Zoom background. Though I'm not there at the moment. I also serve as Director of Medical Education Programs for Lecturio, and my clinical background is that of a cardiac surgeon, and I am still practicing, though the majority of my efforts are focused on education, and I am based and practice in Baltimore, Maryland. It is a real pleasure that I can introduce Dr. Rajuno Ettarh, who is Associate Dean for Pre-Clerkship Curriculum and Assessments and the Professor of Anatomy and Medical Education at the California University of Science and Medicine. He helps run a truly unique program, and you will see what they've done. So Dr. Ettarh, welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us, and particular thanks also to the whole crew at Lecturio. Stefan Wischbauer is the co-CEO and is helping physicians like Dr. Ettarh and I disseminate these concepts and provide the technical expertise to put this on, and for all the coordination efforts. And Daniel and Jackie and Rosie and the whole team have made this possible. So let's go to the next slide. And Jackie, you have the slides there. There we are. And so I basically have disclosed my three relationships. Nope, we need to go back one. My three relationships, and they're all very synergistic. So I'm very fortunate to have to be able to develop this these educational endeavors and still have a practice. And Dr. Ettarh, do you have any disclosures additional disclosures that you would like to add at this time?
Oh, no, none. Thank you, Peter.
Very good, very good. So next slide. And I just, as we can already see, we have almost 300 participants today. And in this series, we've been really fortunate to bring together a global community to help solve many problems that have emerged from the pandemic, but our focus, of course, being that of medical education. And this is sort of just a brief synopsis of the participants in this webinar series to date. So whoever says we're not part of a global community has not seen what's happening, at least in the medical education sector. So in the next slide, we can see that epidemics, pandemics have historically always led to reform. And I've cited this in the previous webinars, that cholera improved sanitation and spurred vaccine development, and the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic that many people are drawing comparisons to highlighted economic disparities and led to improved housing and healthcare. So in the next slide, we ask the question, Jackie, you have the next slide there. What will be COVID-19's silver lining? I think we all need to see the good as we struggle through many of the challenges of this pandemic. And we felt that most of us had been forced into what we called emergency remote teaching. And what we'd like to see as the silver lining is if we can emerge from this with an approach of evidence-based medical education. And to show, just to revisit what that looked like in the next slide. This is a picture of this emergency remote teaching, basically the same traditional teaching model implemented online. And in the next slide, we propose that what we should be doing is transforming the current reality. And that transformation should be based on evidence-based medical education. And as practitioners, we all practice evidence-based medicine. And if you think about the parallels between practicing evidence-based medicine, they're all very applicable to medical education. You assess needs, you ask questions, you acquire and appraise evidence, you apply that evidence, and then you assess impact due to your actions. And in the next slide, we had previously examined how the evidence would support or not the traditional method of teaching, the teacher-directed learning model, which has been around literally for centuries, versus the student-centered learning model. And Dr. Hirumi, who we had the pleasure of having as a speaker, it pointed out how it's truly the student-centered model which the evidence supports. So in the next slide, we came to the conclusion that we really needed to aim towards a transformation of the educational process. And as part of that, we felt that platform-based learning would be the new gold standard. Many of us remember being challenged trying to figure out various computer programs, and now we can't live without them. And I predict that platforms will become this new educational necessity. They greatly augment and facilitate the ability to do what we're going to discuss today, apply this flipped classroom approach. And that in turn opens the door to applying evidence-based learning strategies and really retiring the notion of the hour-long live lecture. We need to move from passive to interactive learning, game learning, and experiential learning. Teachers should be more like coaches and mentors and motivators, as well as creators of content. The person-to-person interaction will be augmented, not diminished. And lastly, if we take this approach, we should have much greater cost effectiveness in education. So in the next slide, we ask the question, and what we're here to address today. Jackie, next. How do we flip courses and facilitate active student-centered learning and meet the needs of the 21st century? And with this goal in mind, I have the real pleasure to turn the mic over to Dr. Ettarh, who I actually had the pleasure of meeting a couple years ago at CUSM, the California University for Science and Medicine. It was really an eye-opening experience. I just joined as executive dean at Ames, and CUSM was a relatively new medical school which was completely based on the flipped classroom model and problem-based learning. And it was really like stepping into the future. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Ettarh and have him describe a little bit what has been done at CUSM and how they've approached this. So Dr. Ettarh, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning to everyone. Let me start by sort of like describing a little bit about our school. So we're a university with only the medical school as its component. So we've got an MD program, and we have a Master of Biomedical Sciences program. So we've got two programs, and we're located in Colton, we've just completed our new medical school building. It's probably open only about 4 weeks. We are about 70 miles east of downtown LA, in San Bernardino County. We started, our first class came in 2018, so we've taken our third cohort. So our charter class has just started their clerkships. Our third class, our current first year class, has got 130 students, which is the maximum capacity for the medical school for the first year class. So why or how did we implement our flipped classroom? We started out from the very beginning to flip the classroom. So our curriculum was designed for a flipped classroom approach. So first thing we did was to establish the program goals. And I mean, I suppose many schools have the same goals as we do. It's all based on the requirements that the components or the elements that we need to put in for an MD program. So established our goals, but we decided we're going to flip the classroom. We defined our delivery strategy. Now that's the one that took a little bit of discussing. In other words, what we decided was we wanted our classroom to flip, but the material needed to be recorded for delivery to the students ahead of class. So the pre-work consisted of recorded learning material. And we'll talk about that in a little while. So we started off using just PowerPoint files and making that available to students, but it meant that we needed to have a whole platform for storing all of that pre-work and making it available to the students. The other thing that we added into the design was an integration between the courses in a systems-based approach. So we divided up our courses into systems. Again, that's not unique. But what we did was we linked each one of those, all of the material in each week to case presentations. So the students learn material for a given week, and that week is associated with a case presentation. And that case presentation is linked back to the material that is learned within that week. So we have an integrated system all across the first and the second year. The other thing we did was we designed a system of learning communities. So the students are assigned to a college right at the very start, a small group, which we call a college. And the students do all of the work to a large extent within the college unit. That college unit, we try not to break the college unit all the way through the first 2 years. So they stay within their colleges for doing work in the flipped classroom. We encourage the students to work within the colleges before they come into class. So pre-work as much as possible within the colleges, work in the classroom within colleges, labs within colleges, clinical skills within colleges. So we try to keep the college intact as the student progresses through the first 2 years. So that defined our strategy for delivering our flipped classroom approach in the first 2 years. Now, that then led to what platforms do we use? We adopted Canvas as our learning management platform. But like I said, we needed to find out where to store all of this, how to sort of like package all of this pre-work so that it was available to the students. So the students get access to Canvas, they log into Canvas, now they can access that pre-work. We wanted our material pre-recorded. So when you're starting off a new medical school and you're suddenly faced with 1,300 odd sessions that need to be pre-recorded, it led us to seeking out resources that could provide that same kind of preparation without us having to put in, the amounts of hours, the number of hours that was required to put up the material together. And that's what led us to Lecturio. Lecturio provided us the ability to start very, very quickly because all of that pre-recorded material was already available. The only other thing that we did was we also signed up to Panopto, which is a delivery system for actually storing videos so that Canvas itself doesn't lend itself to video delivery. Panopto integrated with Canvas helps, but that's just one example of how we try to utilize platforms that allowed us to deliver a recorded material-based strategy for pre-work for the students before coming into class. And then we designed an assessment strategy to help us capture whatever learning was happening within our curriculum delivery strategy, our learning strategy with our curriculum design. So that was our approach, that was our intention, that was our design. Jackie, we'll move on to the next slide. We can talk about how we actually did this for real within the medical school. Next slide.
So did the pre-recorded lectures come from you and your team, or were they pre-recorded from, I always wonder if me as the faculty, if I need to be the person delivering the pre-recorded material.
Right, so thanks, Sarah. That's a great question, and one that for which we had a lot of discussion. There is, I mean, as you can well imagine, there's a certain amount of ownership that comes with teaching learners. Some educators prefer to deliver or create their own material, but I think there's also a fine balance between the time you do have to do it and your desire to do it. So if you look at our particular set of circumstances, we had all of that material to put out before the students arrived, and there just wasn't anything already in place. So that led us to looking for solutions that were already available that, in a sense, buys you time, so you have material you can use while you develop your own materials. And some of the solutions that are available commercially allow you to integrate your own material prepared or recorded material into the vendor solution that you have, so that you get the best of, in a sense, the best of both worlds, which is what we did. We have a blend of material that we sourced from outside and material that we continue to produce on the inside, and we're able to deliver both that blend to our students.
Thank you, appreciate it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this slide, in a sense, I put this slide together to try and help give you guys a sense of what we had to go to trying to define what we wanted out of the flipped classroom. Now, I know it looks like a busy slide, so I'll take it a bit at a time. We've got 3 lines here. We've got a red line, a blue line, and a white broken or dotted line. Now, those 3 lines represent approaches for delivering or learning material for the learner. So if we take the starting point for all 3 lines is the availability of material for the student, what in a flipped classroom approach we call the pre-work. So if you look at it, irrespective of which line the learner goes through, the material for learning is always available to the student. So it could be a textbook in the library. It could be a PowerPoint lecture that you have put together and you've made it available on the learning management system for the students ahead of the class. So to a large extent, all of that material is usually available to all learners ahead of any classroom or non-classroom approach that we adopt for learning with the learners. So all of that learning material starts off being available. So if it's a recording, it's available. Now, if we take the red line, that's the traditional lecture approach. The student comes into class, the concepts are presented to the learner, this learner listens, tries to remember or understand. There's clarifications provided during the lecture. So a student might ask a question, faculty or the instructor provides an answer, and the student receives that clarification within the classroom setting. Now, when the lecture is over, the student, if we continue the red line, the student that's in class now, the student comes back out of class, and the student now engages in independent post-instructional learning. And the student tries to analyze, evaluate, apply concepts they've learned in the class. They might talk to some of their classmates, so peer learning occurs outside of the classroom. And the material that they used to start off that material, that recorded material or textbook or PDF that was available before they got to the lecture is still available for them to go back and look at. So all of that represents our red line approach or the traditional classroom approach. Now with the flipped classroom, when the student, we take the blue line, again, there's pre-recorded material, pre-work available. The student is expected to look at that and then come into the classroom. But in the classroom, the objectives are slightly different. Now, the idea is, if we break it down into those two blue boxes, metacognition and collaboration. In other words, the student is now applying material or information that they have learned from the material that they looked at before coming into class. The students analyze, evaluate, apply concepts, solve problems, and receive feedback during the process in the flipped classroom. So what that does for the student is now, instead of just listening and remembering and understanding, the student is working with the instructor to apply all of those concepts in a flipped classroom setting. Now, when that is over, the student again out of class is able to go back and review all of the learning and the material that they looked at for pre-work in post-instructional learning. In other words, the same process that the students who go through a traditional approach engage in after class, that same approach happens outside of class. Now, we have added a third line, the out of class, the white line, the white broken line. I've added that line because it's a recognition of the reality that we're faced with today. In other words, there are students who opt not to attend some lectures. There are students who opt not to attend some flipped classroom sessions. Those students remain or adopt the out of class approach. In other words, the learning material is still available to the students. The student opts not to attend a particular lecture or a particular flipped classroom session, but is still able to engage in post-instructional learning, analyze, evaluate, and apply concepts with their peers using those same materials, and still achieve some kind of learning that is measurable on the outcome, when we look at outcomes for each of these three approaches. So that's the conceptual, if you like, the conceptual approach for those three different lines of learning pathways, if we want to call it, all the way to a learning outcome. Jackie, we go on to the next slide.
And actually, before we move, I just wanted to actually, Raj, this is just such a wonderful slide because it sort of allows us to visualize, what has been. And Jackie, just go back for 1 second. The blue line is really where we want to shift our students, and there's a recognition that many of our students, the brighter ones, can stay in that dotted line and figure it out. But aren't we trying to make education more effective? Certainly for those students that need more help. And if you look at what's in your blue boxes, the metacognition, the collaborative learning strategies, these are specifically the strategies that have a very solid basis in science, in learning science. And so as we take an evidence-based approach to education, if you all just remember this slide and trying to get all your students to that blue line, the brighter ones will do better. The ones struggling will learn more effectively. So sorry to jump in, but
oh no, thanks, Peter.
One of my favorites.
No, that's thanks, Peter, for that addition. I mean, the other thing that I guess I should point out here as well is, I know that I've titled the slide "Objectives and Outcomes." So when we're looking at outcomes, one thing that certainly for us in CS and that we worry about is how we measure the effect of what we do. So if we look at any of these lines, if we take the blue line, the flipped classroom line, the question then becomes, how can we measure the effectiveness of our flipped classroom? So if we go all the way to the end of the lines, the outcomes, we are measuring, it would seem to us that we're measuring not just the pre-working that the student does before coming to class, not just the flipped classroom experience, it also includes the post-instructional learning. All of those three efforts are captured in our assessments when we do that at the very end of the line. But if we were trying to capture the effect of the flipped classroom, that one good way to assess that effect would be to look at the blue line right after the flipped classroom experience, before the student has had a chance to engage with his peers or do some post-instructional studying of their own. But we'll come to that when we talk about outcomes, the kinds of outcomes that we are able to, or we see when we look at what we did at CUSM. Jackie, thanks. Next slide. Right, so this is what we did. So we had a program, we broke up our program into courses, and we defined our pedagogy. So we knew, we thought we had a design for what we wanted to do. Now it came to the learning materials, and we wanted to use, we started of using recorded PowerPoint slides. So that was pretty simple. You have a PowerPoint slide, you basically talk over your slides, and you put that package, the voice and the slides together as a recorded PowerPoint. We also were able to easily create PDF files from that material. But we wanted a recorded option. Now we had Panopto, which allows you to deliver that recorded PowerPoint material. That's how we started. But again, the task, the sheer volume of material that we needed to create led us to solutions that could deliver that same experience very, very quickly before we're able to put all of our efforts in place. And that led us to Lecturio. It allowed us to be able to deploy our strategy and our approach using an available solution before we had a chance to actually develop our own material. And then in the flipped classroom, I suppose the challenge is always, what do you then do when you get into the flipped classroom? In other words, you've got the students, you've given them this material, you've done all this pre-work, they come into the class. What do we do with the learners? And at CUSM, what we did was we run, what we do now is we run a readiness assurance test. What that gives the instructors is a measure of how much pre-work the students have done before coming into class. It allows us to sort of like partition the learning or the amount of knowledge or learning in the class before the session starts into material that is clearly understood and probably does not require too much discussion in the flipped classroom, and material that's still exposing a challenge to learners within the class. Now, for us, we use the testing platform that we use allows us to get our outcomes, our testing outcomes immediately. So the students come into class at 8 o'clock, and by 8:15, we have all of our outcomes for the instructor for the flipped classroom session. And then the rest of the session is devoted to problem solving. In other words, remember our aim is metacognition, so we're analyzing, we're applying concepts, we're problem solving, we're walking our way through thought questions, and the students are walking through those problems and questions in groups. In other words, in their college units. Our classroom is laid out in colleges, so the students sit at tables that are defined by their colleges. Now, some of our faculty have taken that a little bit further and introduced gaming strategies. So again, rather than the problem or the thought question is folded into a gaming strategy, and that seems to be quite popular with some of the students. Again, like I said, peer teaching and small group approach. When we look at readiness assurance, we run our readiness assurance in 2 stages. In other words, the students first take a readiness assurance test individually, and then they do the same questions again as a group, so that it allows peer teaching and group teaching to occur at the tables before the instructors begin the flipped classroom session. Now, that just defines our flipped classroom approach. In addition to all of this, the elements to the right of the slide just describe all of the extra bits that we have within our curriculum. So we've got the case presentations, which augments the learning in the flipped classroom approach. We've also got labs in anatomy. We run labs in anatomy, physiology, microbiology, pathology. And then our assessments include the readiness assurance, which gives us a measure of how students are progressing coming into the flipped classroom every day. And we also have assessments for the other elements. We've got evaluations of our case presentations, lab practicals. And we also measure professionalism. Jackie, next slide, please. Right, COVID. Now, it was all going well until the virus arrived, and we realized we needed to change some of the things we're doing from in-person to online. Now, it turns out that what we already had in place, put us in a good position for trying to realign or adapt our teaching to the COVID environment. So we already had our pedagogy in place. We had recorded material for pre-work that was already available in a learning management system that could be delivered in an online manner. So the students could still access the learning management system from home. They could still access all of that material. So we didn't need to change any of the pre-work approach. Faculty could still produce PowerPoint recordings or PDFs. They could still deliver that to the learning management platform. Faculty still had access to Lecturio. Students still had access to Lecturio. So all of that turned out to be, we were very lucky that all of that still stayed in place. Now for the flipped classroom, what we needed to do now was deliver the flipped classroom sessions through using an online delivery method. And I guess the two extra things that we added to our approach was the fact that we had to choose an online platform, and we could now use online platforms that provided, for example, breakout rooms that would allow us to still keep our college or small group teaching approach in the flipped classroom delivery strategy that we have. So we were still able to deliver our readiness assurance testing online. We're still able to walk through problems and thought questions with students in groups, in breakout rooms, or we're still able to preserve that college, that group learning or peer teaching that we had before we moved to an online platform. Jackie, next slide, please. So I guess what I did then was sort of like put some of our all of that experience summarized in a set of objectives, which many of you probably have seen at this point. It's become clear to us that the virtual classroom requires required a very clear idea of what we wanted to do with the virtual classroom, in contrast to a sort of like in-person classroom. So we needed to establish very clear learning objectives for a virtual classroom. So we take, for example, the lab in an anatomy lab in person, the students are holding specimens in their hands. We thought, okay, that works, but clearly when it comes to an online environment, the students are not able to hold the specimens in their hands. So we needed to be clear what the learning outcomes would be in that kind of environment without diluting the purpose of the learning. In other words, the learning still needed to achieve the same outcomes. They still needed to be able to learn anatomy in a practical sense, but we needed to be able to do that in an online environment. We also realized, or we have now realized, that engagement for learners is very different. There's more sort of like working with the keyboard for the learner, as opposed to in person where you might have a learner working on a device or have a learner working with a book and a pen. So there's more sort of like keyboard working with the learner. For the instructor, we found that the students have now become more and more excited by instructors who have gone back to the old-fashioned whiteboard scribbling or whiteboard interaction. So um, we find that faculty are having to move away from PowerPoint delivery, which was stuff that we did in person, to delivery methods that in a sense require the instructor to interact with their presentation so that the students see a live interaction between instructor and their material while they're delivering that experience online. The other thing that is missing in an online environment is the usual sort of feedback that we get in person. So the sort of like talking, the laughter, the chatter, the verbal feedback, the visual feedback, all of that's absent. So it has forced us to look at our online virtual sessions as similar to a phone-in radio program. So we don't have any sessions that are hour long. We think the way you would think in designing a radio program. In other words, you don't have an audience. You do have an audience that is remote, but we need to be able to interact with that audience in a slightly different way compared to in person. The other thing we discovered was the public side conversations. There were a lot of public side conversations. So the students used the chat function for our online delivery platforms quite frequently. And for instructors, we now recognize that although we are trying to engage the students are also engaged between themselves in side conversations that may or may not be related to some of the material that we teach, but nevertheless may be useful in the overall learning that session is designed to accomplish. And we have found that using
I'm ready in 5 minutes.
We found that using students as teaching assistants, if it is possible, we've found that very, very helpful. So our second year students help us. We get a couple of second year students to help us in the first year labs, and that has made certainly helped manage the number of students that we have in an online environment when you run in something like a lab. I guess certainly because we run our assessments at the end of every course, we had to deal with the challenge of assessments very early on. And we now find that for us, the 2 device per examinee approach works for us, the best for us. One device to take the exam and the second device to sort of like use for proctoring the exam environment. Next slide, please, Jackie. Now, I've added this slide because I think everything I've said is, in many ways, it's planning, it's administration, it's implementation. But the one thing that is necessary for all of that to succeed is a belief among students, faculty, and staff. They need to be able to see where all of this is leading. So irrespective of the approach, if it's a flipped classroom approach or a teaching approach or a case-based approach, if the students and faculty are able to see what the goal is, it makes a big difference in the implementation. It makes implementation a lot easier. And if you take a look at that diagram, you got 6 people pulling, in a sense, attempting the impossible, it would seem, pulling weights, a weight that is far exceeds their combined individual weights, or the combination of the individual weights. And that's effectively what most institutions try to do when they try to implement any learning strategy. You're trying to create a direction for the institution, and that direction is can only be successfully defined by the students, the faculty, and staff. But everybody has to believe that it is possible and see that it is possible. And once that happens, at least in our experience, we found that it made learning, our implementation for our flipped classroom strategy a lot easier. Next slide, Jackie. Now this brings us to performance and outcomes. So how do we measure what we do? If you take a look at the classroom, you can see we've got students arranged in tables. This is This is a photograph taken from our labs, anatomy lab in the in our temporary building before we moved into a new building. And the students are arranged according to the colleges. So they're looking at material that is placed on the table, and they work together as a group. So there's sort of like group interaction, peer learning, and then the faculty and scrubs and the faculty go around and engage with each college to see that each college is basically walking through the tasks that are assigned for that session. But when it comes to, when we take a look at the table, in terms of the flipped classroom approach, the idea for the flipped classroom for us was to improve metacognition and collaboration. So we measure that using our examinations, and we measure collaboration by asking the students to complete evaluations of the members in their colleges. So we have that data. Now, for the rest of when a course is completed, we still run, student satisfaction, faculty satisfaction surveys, and that gives us data on how happy or unhappy the students are with the design of the curriculum and the design or the delivery of the courses. And that allows us to make improvements and enhancements that are necessary to improve the learning environment for the students. In terms of our examinations, we have data we collect data on the readiness assurance, we collect data on the course performances at the end of every course. The students take NBME examination, so we get external validation of some of our approaches and learning from our courses and the curriculum on the inside. And all of that material, all of that information or data, if you like, when we look at it over the last 2 years, the first and second year students, and now we've got the step 1 data to add to that. So far, the outcomes have been very, very good. But again, those outcomes represent, in a sense, the effect of all the different elements of the curricular design and approach that we have. All of that come together in the outcome measures that we have put in place. Next slide, Jackie. So faculty and students have to believe in the strategy and the vision. Our satisfaction, like I said, at least with us at CUSM, the satisfaction with our curriculum arrangement and with the outcomes has been very good. And the platform utilization. Now like I've mentioned, we've got a few software programs that we use, and application platforms that we use for delivering our curriculum. And that utilization increases the greater the integration is between that platform and the curriculum. So if we take something like Lecturio and we say, okay, though we are using that to deliver our recorded material, that integration between the material itself and the way the students access that material is very important. If the integration is, the better the integration, the greater the integration, the bigger the utilization. And like I've previously explained it with us at CSM, we've used Lecturio to assign videos, quizzes that are associated with the videos, and all of those, the greater the alignment is between that material and the courses, then the better the platform utilization is by faculty and learners at the school. Jackie, next slide, please. Right. So in the COVID environment, now I know we talk about the post-COVID classroom, and certainly it doesn't seem like COVID's going away anytime soon. So we really have to continue to envision the classroom with restrictions that are imposed by circumstances that are unrelated to education, but which we have to live with and manage within the learning environment. So what will an online classroom, what will a COVID classroom look like? At the moment, it is platform-based. The students have to interact with the instructor through a device. And that device, that interaction, that device-based interaction means that as educators, we now have to plan, not just for the way we deliver instruction, we also have to plan for the instruments that we use to deliver that instruction and to interact with our learners. Jackie, next slide, please. So what have we learned? At CUSM, we were very, very lucky. Our approach at the design stage turned out to be one that worked very well for an online environment. So although we got, we had to work within in what I call a COVID environment, it looks like our future going forward is good simply because we're lucky enough to have put in place the approach and the technology associated with it, all of that combined to put us in a very good position for dealing with an online delivery system. I added a little blue circle there where it says yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery. Yes, I mean, the chances of us going back to in-person at the moment don't look good anytime soon. So we have to, for us as instructors, we have sort of like stopped worrying about what we do if we go back into the classroom. We're now beginning to think about what do we do going forward? How do we take what is, what we think are very good advantages from the virtual online environment, and how do we use that to improve and enhance learning going forward, irrespective of which environment we find ourselves in tomorrow. So in other words, we've got, certainly in our case in CUSM, we've got group participation, we've got unique communication skills. You know, now we've got online chat windows that we've had 6 months of experience teaching through using chat online windows. We've got 6 months experience polling. We've got 6 months experience with students interacting in ways that they didn't interact before all of this started. And that has given us some insights into some of the advantages that could be implemented irrespective of the environment going forward. For us at CSM, the takeaway is belief, integration, and technology. Technology we have in place. Integration we had before all of this, but we've had to concentrate on keeping that integration as good as we can, and ensuring that the students believe in the vision, the objectives, and the outcomes, and the implementation of our strategies for an online learning environment. Jackie, next slide, please.
And I have to say that this has just been an amazing presentation, and I still think back to my visit, and I hope everybody shares my awe at what you've done, really starting from scratch, and granted there are advantages when you start a new med school as opposed to shifting. And I love the picture of your big tanker, because institutions can be hard to move. And we're going to open this up to questions in a little bit, but I thought it would be worthwhile to just get a perspective of the school that I help run in Jamaica, because it in many ways comes from a very different paradigm in an under-resourced country. Jackie, and this is a picture of it, but Jackie, in the next slide, you can see it was founded by a visionary physician who was originally from India, and who was practicing surgery in the country and saw a need for a more progressive approach to training physicians. And the founder is Dr. Ram Chalasani, who's immediately to my left in this picture. And his vision was to use technology to provide quality medical education at a very modest cost. And what's pictured here actually is the entire preclinical staff and administration. And this school also is quite new, but has been very successful and is growing rapidly. The primary intent is to provide greatly needed physicians in Jamaica, but aimed as graduates can practice anywhere in the world. And 2 of our recent graduates just matched in US residencies where they're going to get additional training. When I joined Ames just 2 years ago, it had a progressive integrated curriculum, but teaching still consisted of traditional lectures. And it was really shortly after joining that I made my visit to CUSM and really felt at that time that this is, the direction that not only we at Ames, but that really all schools should be going. And so the next slide, Jackie. Next slide, please. I have grabbed this from Dr. Ettarh and used it again because I think it is so wonderful and absolutely true. Everybody needs to believe if you take on this endeavor, and I would encourage all schools to, not just well-funded in new schools or in countries like the US. I think anybody can do this, but everybody needs to pull together. And you may not recognize it here because everybody's in masks and in outfits, but that's actually me at the front of the line. But Dr. Chalasani, our founder, is right behind me, and he pulls harder than anybody else. And as do the other key faculty. So, this is exactly what we're trying to do at Ames as well. So in the next slide, like CUSM, we found that teaching platforms are the key. The curated content and quality teaching materials in multiple formats are crucial. We have a very small faculty, and this is augmented by the huge faculty that can come via platform. You can guide delivery. Very importantly, you can implement evidence-based strategies such as spaced retrieval and interleaving. We've talked about this in the previous seminars. Data tracking to see who is doing what. And most importantly, this can greatly facilitate a student-centered active learning approach, such as the flipped classroom. So Jackie, next slide. And since we're running a little short on time, I'm going to run through these relatively quickly because many of you in the previous webinars have seen these, but I just wanted you to get a look of what this platform looks like, where these lectures are in videos that students can play at the speed they want. The anatomy ones are associated with interactive 3D models. And very importantly, Jackie, in the next slide, you will see that all lectures are followed by recall questions. Again, this is straight out of learning science to help with retention. In the next slide, you'll see that the recall questions, you enter a bank that you then have to, it enters into an algorithm-based repetition engine, and that gets sent back to the students at intervals based on the confidence that they had in answering the question, again, to augment retention. And in the next slide, all this, as Dr. Ettarh has alluded to, is assignable. So you can assign the lectures from the platform or those that you add yourself. In the next slide, you can then track these assignments and drill down so you can see in this particular lecture at the very bottom, the systemic ECG interpretation. Next slide, you will see each individual question that comes after a lecture. And then one more slide down, you can just keep drilling down. And this is where technology is so helpful. You can see who answered the question correctly on the first go or how many attempts. You will notice that in the last attempt, everybody got it right. And that's because we want everybody to do the work, what the cognitive scientists call desirable difficulty, to actually figure out the answer before they move on. And in the next slide, you can see the overall use statistics. So look at the lectures, the recall questions. For a very small school, this is actually the use statistics at Ames. So in the next slide, this really just recaps what we've gone over, that the key advantage to implementing a flipped classroom is creating an environment for productive interactivity. As Dr. Ettarh has outlined, the students learn before class, the faculty get insights before class. The class time is therefore targeted and very efficient, and it allows the students to process the new knowledge. So in the next slide, I have sort of my tips from my experience, and where it aims, it's still very much a work in progress. This takes time. Before trying this, it is important to be organized and to get help. I rely on the help from instructional designers who basically live in the space of evidence-based learning science and can help guide us. And it's important as you talk to students and faculty to help convey those notions. At Ames, we have posters that have the strategies from Make It Stick, a popular book from cognitive science many of you may be familiar with. We try and help everybody understand why we're doing what we're doing. And it's an iterative process. Frankly, COVID-19 has helped a bit. And I still remember when the pandemic hit, and there was clearly resistance from some faculty. Why are we doing online exams and using this platform? And apparently I found out that somebody had asked whether I had unleashed COVID-19 just to prove how effective and how important learning platforms could be. And as you implement these ideas, it's important to simplify the process and get the right tools for implementation, modify it to fit your circumstances. Every school is a bit different. Introduce it incrementally. You don't have to do what CUSUM has done is absolutely remarkable. And I hold that out as to where I want to be, just like being on that beach behind Dr. Ettarh. You have your goal of where you want to get to in his backdrop. Introduce it in phases, have realistic expectations, track the results and be willing to adjust, and be patient and persistent. This isn't going to happen easily, but it's going to be worthwhile. So to sum up, in the next slide, we have, next, Jackie. There. You have a lag. Yeah, great, thanks. So what we've talked about is moving from the classic teacher-directed methods and materials to active student learning. And in the next slide, we're going to, and next, and one of the best ways to implement active student learning is through this flipped classroom, but I wouldn't get hung up on calling it a flipped classroom. I think that the real goal is to create interactivity, and really what was actually described almost 100 years ago is this concept of experiential learning. And these are the principles supported by learning science. And so next slide. Really what we all need to focus on, I believe, is to adopt an evidence-based approach to teaching and learning. And if you keep that at heart with everything you do, I think we will gain a silver lining out of COVID-19 and have truly re-envisioned medical education. So in the next slide, we now want to involve you all, and we have some polling questions that Jackie, if you could put the first polling questions up. In the next slide, you'll see them. There we are. And this is one of the subjects, Dr. Ettarh, we brought up, and we still all need to work together to learn as a community. You know, is what we're doing truly better? I'm not suggesting we have the answers, but I think we've looked to the science. We know what makes sense. We know what's working at CUSM, and I believe it'll work at Ames. So if we could, how do you think the effectiveness of an interactive flipped classroom could best be measured? And so please answer the question. And I can see a lot of people are taking all of the above, and that's exactly right. So do you want to, we can close that and put that up. And all of the above is the clear winner. It really depends on, you know, multiple factors. But what's most important is that you analyze what you're doing, and hopefully we can all stay connected and work together and share those results. And so in the next slide, Jackie, if we close that. And we put the next slide up. What are the biggest challenges you see in implementing an interactive or flipped classroom approach in your institution? Faculty resistance, student resistance, lack of training resources and understanding, lack of supporting technology, lack of administrative support. And pretty evenly divided, as I can see. So lack of training resources and understanding. And that actually is, in a way, is good to see, because that's the most easily addressed. And so, you know, that I know that I would be more than happy, Dr. Ettarh and the folks at Lecturio can help provide these resources. And in terms of understanding, I would encourage you all to reach out to instructional designers, who I think have been underappreciated in the educational process, but really are experts in this field, and I can help point you in that direction. So in the last slide, Jackie, next slide, please. Next. One before that, I think it just hopped two ahead. There we go. I think this is very important, and I'd like to each of you, and I have had this slide at the end of all our seminars, is to challenge each of you to think of what you will do to change the way medicine is taught. This isn't going to happen if we all don't individually push the envelope on this. And frankly, this is coming, like it or not, and if you don't, someone else will. So with that, let's go to the next slide, open it up to questions. I see lots of questions in the chat box. I don't know if Stefan, you want to tee up some questions and see what people are asking. And Dr. Ettarh and I would be more than pleased to tell you about our particular programs and you know, what next steps might be.
Sure. So there's one question from Shwani here, which was saying, Is the flipped curriculum content and didactic discussion format part of Lecturio? Meaning, does it give the discussion topics and content that is to be done in the live classroom?
Dr. Raj, do you want to address your use in that context?
Yes, I can. Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, this is about how much detail there is in the Lecturio content. So for the way we use Lecturios, faculty, an instructor is able to go into Lecturio and take a look at the material. They're able to watch the video if you want to watch the video, or look at the transcript of the text transcript of the voice from the video, and decide and assess how much information there is in that, and then assign that material to the session in their course or their curriculum to the students. So that level of detail is available in Lecturio. Yes, it is available in Lecturio. So you can match the material in Lecturio to the information that you want the students to learn or gain from the session that you planned in your own course.
Great. Peter, I don't know if you want to add anything. Obviously, the material can be leveraged in the classroom as well if you want to discuss, a case question in the classroom, show the results, or play a video or other things, then that's an option. It's a trickier question for you, Dr. Raj. So that one is, how do you check the skills during physical examination if students aren't at their homes?
Yeah, so that's that was a sort of big challenge for us, but it turns out that, again, it's all dependent on the platform. We thought at the very start that was something we would have to sort of maybe park to one side and come back to it later. But it's turned out that we've got very, very unique solutions for how we deal with clinical skills. So we still work with students. So basically you get 4 students in a team, and you can get a 4-screen display on the computer, so that you get 1 student acting as the doctor, and 1 student acting as the physician, 1 student acting as a patient. And you've got the instructor and your standardized patient. And looking at the screen, it is possible to approximate, to some extent, history-taking skills, for example, using that 4-picture display on the computer. And it has worked. It doesn't quite give you the full hands-on experience you would get in an in-person interaction, but it has allowed us to capture some of the important elements for history-taking skills, even without an in-person interaction. Now, for physical skills, at the moment, we're asking the students to go beyond history-taking and walk in pairs. So in other words, the students, if you have either a housemate or roommate or classmate that lives with you, and we're asking them to walk in pairs on screen so that the physical examination can be assessed by the instructor on the screen, and feedback can be delivered on the screen as well. So in terms of solutions on screen, we've been able to explore solutions that simply by trial and error, we managed to arrive at solutions that we think give us a good approximation of the kind of skills that we would expect to measure or assess in person. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what we expected before we started.
And it's interesting how we widened the sort of potential participants in these things, the roommate, the family, maybe the neighbor, depending on the distancing guidelines and so on. And then, the video allows you to assess and observe quite effectively, right? And even record and document if you want.
We record those sessions so that the instructor can go back and evaluate the interaction using the recorded video.
Yeah, and I'll just add something that you don't have in action yet, I think, Dr. Raj, is we actually added a simulation component with systematic physical exam taking. We can show you if you haven't seen it yet, okay, because of that specific need, and that is completely integrated. You can assign things, you can track the completion by students and so on and so forth. Obviously, you can use it in webinars. The students can even use it self-directed. It goes all the way through to treatment and ordering exams and getting the results and so on. So the technology, again, enables at least some degree of these kinds of face-to-face processes that, and should never completely replace them, but simply, do the best it can in the current disrupted environment, and then potentially enrich, future optimized environments where we then have the full range of claviature of tools, to leverage.
Yeah, I just to add, I mean, I think we're just at the beginning of exploring all the potential things that we can use. And we're going to find that some of them are widely applicable and others are more, are just going to get us through the pandemic. But I think we're going to come out of this with some neat new tools. There are questions I see in the chat box about assessments, the OSCEs and the like. And I think these are areas that we need to explore. I have, always felt very strongly, though, that ultimately the physicians, to be trained as a physician, there'll need to be a lot of actual person-to-person contact. And in the prior programs I've been involved with that were more online based, we always insisted on this. So in the post-COVID era, I think we are going to be in a truly hybrid environment of using technological resources to augment knowledge acquisition and comprehension and understanding, but never lose the personal touch. And in the interim, it's great to work and you get to know a lot of people via, video conferencing.
And see them more closely than in your large lecture hall as well, right?
Exactly.
Even pin their video if you want to sneak up on them. But the further question here, which I think just requires a brief clarification from Dr. Kachur, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Should participation really depend on whether students are bright or not so bright? And I don't think that was the suggestion, if I understood it correctly. It was just how was the effect be on different kinds of students, and it would kind of assist all of them, right?
Exactly, and I'll expound on that. And I actually have the great privilege. So, I am executive dean at Ames in Jamaica, but I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm here because I came for medical school, where I went at Hopkins, and I still stay in touch with my colleagues at Hopkins. That is obviously a fairly select med school class, and I advocate for these approaches to all students, regardless of background. I also feel that there's much more commonality. This is not a matter of inherent intelligence, but many students come from more advantaged backgrounds. And I have to admit that I had a very educationally rich background, but I've been impressed in the programs. I started one, helped launch one in the South Pacific in Samoa, where students can learn very quickly, given the proper tools and techniques. So this is a matter of moving that, that red line and the white line in Dr. Ettarh's wonderful slide to the blue line, and everybody will benefit from it without exception. I think these principles work throughout.
And then we had a question from Dr. Lee in Edinburgh, and that is around, he's saying, they're encouraging educators to create many short pre-recorded rather than few longer recordings. Certainly in our whole design, that is one of our key principles. We have like 3 to 10 minute lectures. And if you look at the learning science, once they get over 12 minutes, the completion rate drops to 25% pretty quickly. You certainly want your learners to complete these units. So Dr. Rush, curious how you have instructed your faculty in that regard.
Yeah, so I mean, that's what we've certainly learned, that the longer the session, the more difficult the engagement, especially in an online environment. So, which is why we remind our instructors and our faculty that they should look at it like a radio program. It's the longer it goes on and less interesting it becomes, the higher the dropout rate. So we have to sort of keep asking ourselves, what do we do to engage the learner and improve the learning process at the same time as quickly as possible without losing the learner?
And to point out that this is straight out of learning science, and sorry to be repeat, but to me this resonates so particularly as a cardiac surgeon. Everything I do is based on science. And I think as educators, we need to take the same approach. So it's been carefully studied what attention spans are, as Stefan was alluding to. The lectorial platform was built based on these principles. And if we just keep going back to the science, I think we're going to improve how we educate significantly.
And I think for anyone taking part, that luckily those are some of the easier changes you can make, even if you have a longer lecture, to sort of encourage people to think about these pause moments and to engage folks, and cutting things up. If you have Zoom recordings like this one, you could cut them into pieces is one way. But, then some other things like spaced retrieval algorithms, like Dr. Horneffer was explaining, get very hard to do in any kind of manual way. You really need the platform and the capabilities to do these things. There was a question on outcomes, and that's always a fascinating one. And what do we optimize for? And I know you, Dr. Horneffer, are very passionate about just not optimizing for exam outcomes, but long-term quality of clinicians. And again, the learning science helps us achieve that. The specific questions was, how do students that attend class compare in terms of outcomes with those who don't? I'm not sure if either of you have the data or meaningful divergence on these fronts, but obviously I want to give you a chance to answer that question if you do.
Go ahead. I mean, I'm going to answer very briefly. I don't, and I really want that data. And so, that's the other thing I just encourage everybody to take a data-centric view towards your programs and your teaching. And just as we do in the practice of medicine, study outcomes, as Dr. Ettarh has alluded to. You need to know, you've got to study your outcomes. You've got to decide what outcomes you're looking for. One of the reasons I find this sort of seemingly obsessive focus on boards now is that many students will effectively cram for these, and we know from the learning science that this doesn't lead to good retention of knowledge. So as we change the process, we need to find systems that encourage learning from day one. And this is one of the really neat things I saw at CUSM, is that bang, from right in the beginning, their assessments. Dr. Ettarh, I think if I remember correctly, I was getting pushback at Ames in that we went from a traditional midterm to final and instituted weekly exams. The cognitive scientists will call this calibration. Where do your students stand? I think you told me that you basically had tests every other day at CUSM. And if it just becomes part of the educational process, it'll lead to less anxiety and longer term, more effective knowledge acquisition. And that's the foundation on which you can do the fun stuff and create good clinicians, good surgeons, and the like. So, but Raj, what do you think?
Yeah. So my one of my roles at CSM is having responsibility for assessment across all the 4 years. So for me, assessment is a big deal. But we look at assessment in I suppose, slightly differently. We define composite assessed outcomes and specific outcomes. So a composite outcome is probably what we're talking about. In other words, if a student at the end of a course, or at the end of let's take a course, at the end of a course takes an assessment, that assessment is an evaluation of all of the components of learning that has occurred coming up to that assessment. So in other words, when we look at that diagram with the red line, the blue line, and the white line, it's a composite of outcome that represents all the effort in flipped classroom, outside flipped classroom, pre-work, post-instructional learning, peer learning, collaboration. That's what we're measuring. So when a student does well in a specific multiple choice examination or an NBME examination, that's a composite outcome, and it's very difficult to tease out what the individual contributory elements are to that outcome. Then we have specific outcomes. In other words, we take any of those lines, the red line or the blue line or the white line, and you define or you measure an outcome somewhere along that pathway that gives you a specific outcome measure for that particular intervention somewhere along the line. So if we take a look at a flipped classroom, we run readiness assurance tests. Those readiness assurance tests are run at the start of the flipped classroom, and they're designed specifically to measure whether the student was prepared coming into class. That's a specific outcome that we measure. So we tend to sort of like group, lay out our data based on specific outcomes and composite outcomes so that we get a clear idea of which elements are working and which elements are not working. But at the end of the day, I guess for program measurement, the outcomes that most people worry about are the composite outcomes. But it allows us as an institution, as an assessment office, to tease out which elements in that composite outcome may or may not be working successfully to contribute to that composite outcome.
And we have a further, Dr. Ettarh, thank you, very helpful, and a further question which sort of is in that vein broadly, their comment around, does the flipped classroom time reduce the time spent face-to-face? I'll do a brief initial comment, which links to the assessment side of things, so the flipped classroom prep time and these kinds of, readiness assessments, as well as the summative assessment that, for example, happens automatically by completing recall questions during videos, feeds useful data to then actually tailor whatever in-person time you have. So if you say I want to teach 10 concepts, you could sort of see it due to the prep stats, which are the top 3, 4 that are better understood and the ones that are less understood, or the less understood ones, you could see the typical mistakes made and so on. So you could optimize your teaching time accordingly. And I think in theory, obviously, you could reduce the face-to-face time a bit, but in practice, that is not the necessary assumption with flipped classroom teaching. As I understand it, you might just have more interactive classrooms. I'd be curious to hear from both of you, Dr. Raj and Dr. Horneffer, in your face-to-face time spent, have you chosen to reduce it versus a traditional approach, or have you kept it the same? Because that's obviously an interesting question there in terms of the effect it might have on time spent in various channels and modalities.
Yeah, so for us, for us at CSM, the calculation, so we've looked at the calculation as a whole unit. So if we take, we add the pre-work time and the classroom time as our unit for instructional time for the student. So if the material was, for example, in a lecture is delivered in an hour, and we as a rule, we split that divide, we make that divide halfway. So in other words, 30 minutes is the pre-work time and 30 minutes is the flipped classroom time. Now, the student may elect to spend more than 30 minutes looking at the material pre-work, and most do, but the time that we have assigned to that material, which allows us to sort of measure the amount of pre-work we provide that the student must complete before coming to class, it's a 30-minute time frame that we're providing for creating that arrangement, and then 30 minutes spent applying the concepts learned in pre-work in the classroom.
And very important and great to hear you describe that. The flipped classroom, has I believe had a bad reputation for many because of how it is very prone to being misapplied. It's easy to assign, and I've heard in some institutions, they didn't like it, and you look and the students are assigned, 6 hours of videos, 10 hours of reading, a cumulative of more hours in the day in preparation, and it just didn't add up. So what you've done at CUSM is exactly what needs to be done, a careful rendering of the amount of material in preparation and weigh that against the time. And as you've pointed out, and I think we all know, both as former medical students and educators, most of the education really happens outside of the classroom. Isn't really the essence here to make these classroom interactions highly effective and interactive, much as I keep drawing analogies to a coach, but I tell my students that they need to do the work of learning, and this flipping of the paradigm, if you would, is just to create an opportunity to help them make their learning as meaningful as possible. And that's why this term experiential learning, or is even more appropriate than interactivity. But they need to, one way or another, they're going to need to learn and do most of the work not in front of a teacher.
Great. And with that, I think, there were repeat questions around the clinical assessment part and things like that. So we covered some of those. You've all hung on with a lot of patience, and we wanted to honor the comments in the chat there. But, I want to feel free to open things up here. So if you want to just unmute yourself and shout out a question, probably not going to get 10 at a time. We'll see. But feel free to do that, and let's have some real dialogue here. Also, if you want to share something in terms of your teaching where you figured out a solution to anything that was raised here, then obviously we want to learn from you as well. It's not meant to be a one-way street, even though often it ends up maybe a 80% one-way street simply because of the time available, but hopefully it's been helpful so far for you. So please feel free and step up with any comments or questions.
Yes, I have a question. As I understand that flipped classroom is heavily dependent on technology. Do we have some data on recall of on-screen content versus on-paper content? I mean, is there any data on that thing? What is the recall of off-screen?
Yes, I know that big picture multimodality works a lot better, but we got Dr. Horneffer and also Dr. Hirumi, if he's still around, has done a lot of research. So I'll let the experts comment first here.
And I don't know, Dr. Ettarh and Dr. Hirumi, I thought was here, but had to leave. I don't believe, especially in this post-COVID era, everybody is on screen. And the other thing I tell my students, it's a very good question. My direct answer is I'm not aware of the direct comparison, but we're in an era where we could look at that. But I would say as a corollary, though, hospitals are all going to ultimately digital records and on-screen formats. So at Ames, our library is completely an e-library. We still have some leftover texts, but there were always issues with text availability and the like. So we have a complete resource that is online, and the students have pushed back and said that it's a bit harder to read. I think it's a matter of habit, and with time, as we're all getting used to wearing face masks every time we leave our computers and go outside, and will for a while, I think we will increasingly learn to read as effectively. That's just my guess. I don't believe there's data.
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but just make an addition here in case it was meant as, firstly, your first comment was like, it's all dependent on technology. I think you can flip the classroom without technology. If your students have a reading pile and they have a list of what they're supposed to read before each classroom, that's doable. It would be the low-tech version. What does certainly exist and makes it richer in terms of the learning science is this dual coding theory. That means if the students aren't meant to just read material, but they have interactive, moving material, voice, and so on, that certainly does increase the learning. I'm not sure if that is what you meant, but I realize your question could be interpreted that way. So that's why I wanted to add that.
Right, and that's absolutely true. You can, but I would argue that why not use the tools at hand to make it better?
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm not suggesting it because I think the evidence is quite strong. Like if you have to consume a lot of material, if you have, graphics, voice, text combined, which a textbook obviously does not give you, I think the evidence for that is pretty strong, and then obviously there's a lot of research around how to optimize the didactics and the formats and the length of these units, and we try to apply that all as well. It gets pretty lonely, I guess, as a medical student with all the concepts flying around if you're supposed to dig through hundreds of pages of books every week as your prep for the flipped classroom. So other comments and questions?
Yeah, and I see in the chat about can Lecturia streamline material to a particular medical school's curriculum, and to get back to what I think both Dr. Ettarh and I have said, it's crucial that every school be considered its own entity. So the direct question is absolutely yes, that these platforms and one of the reasons I think we get great benefit out of Lecturio is that the materials can be mapped to curricula and then other custom materials added. And that's really what I think is needed, that every school probably has about 80% commonality and 20% of what is unique and important. And you need to create a solution that works for your school. So this bit of customization is possible and is crucial.
And the one thing I will add, I think there was I'm not sure if I'm recalling the name of it, was the Cochrane study out of the UK, but it looked at, the different outcomes of different curricula. And one of the conclusions at least was, it's not the curriculum primarily that drives better outcomes, but it's really how you deliver it, So if you've got a certain curriculum and you're hearing about other curricula, I think there are some clear trends, more towards subject-based and in terms of learning formats, more towards active and so on. But really a lot is down to the execution and how well you deliver and optimize and hopefully tailor to the individual students and groups and so on,
And to add that, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that's where the evidence is in how you've got to have methodology and how you teach. And that's actually exactly why we're here looking at this strategy of flipping the classroom and improving interactivity. So that's absolutely true. And curricular designs are really an attempt to address one facet of what the instructional designers will look at, the whole piece. And this is really to me, has been a new approach to the educational process. And me, because as a physician, very few of us were formally trained in instructional techniques and instructional design, unless one had special training in this. But we're learning. I am certainly learning from that group and that specialty.
Great. Other comments or questions?
Yeah, good evening.
Dr. Kumar, welcome.
Yeah, good evening. I want to ask you one thing, that because flipped classroom is entirely dependent on pre-classroom activity. So how do we ensure that the pre-class engagement of the student?
Dr. Ettarh, I'll let you, reiterate that as, in that readiness assessment piece. And that's exactly right. I mean, that's what one needs to do via however it's done. And that, from our standpoint, whether it's through data generated on a platform, as I showed you, we could drill down and see who got what question right and whether assignments are completed. Raj, you use your readiness assessment tool, which is a very classic flipped classroom tool. And so maybe just describe that again for a minute.
Yeah, so for us anyway, the flipped classroom approach is designed, part of the design we have is to check to see whether the students are ready for the flipped classroom session itself. So we started by measuring what the students know about the conceptual material that is going to be applied in that session. And although we use technology, that assessment can be done in various different ways. You can have it as a pencil and paper exercise. So you print out your questions. We have our approach is two assessment questions per discipline. So for example, if I am given a lecture in anatomy, for example, I would have, that session would have two questions for that session. If we're having back-to-back sessions, so if, for example, we're having a 30-minute session in anatomy and a 30-minute session on physiology, we would start off with 4 questions, 2 questions in anatomy, 2 questions in physiology. So that way, we now have an understanding of what kind of level of background knowledge based on the pre-work the students have done coming into the class. Now, some students don't do the pre-work because they probably have enough background knowledge based on prior experience coming into the flipped classroom. So the assessment test is designed for us to gauge the level of knowledge for the concept in the classroom before we start applying those concepts inside the classroom. But yes, you're right. It's not, it doesn't have to be dependent on technology, though that technology makes it a lot easier because you can get your returns, you can get your outcomes very, very, very quickly. In our own case, within 60 seconds, we can get the entire outcome for those items in the classroom. But you certainly can use other methods. You can, show of hands. You can use paper and pencil. All of those help you to get an idea of how the students have done. You can actually ask the question verbally in the class and get a show of hands, and that'll give you an idea, what the background knowledge is in the classroom before you start. But it helps us guide the design of the flipped classroom learning session itself inside the classroom.
And it makes me think as we make this transition, those of us that grew up writing letters and have transitioned to emails and what we're able to do. And I'm asked, well, do we really need all this technology, need to change? And I remind folks that our students, as the amount of knowledge and the knowledge base increases and there's more and more known, our students are expected to know more. And so my answer is that that technology is really the same technology that is creating and helping us gain this extra knowledge. We have a responsibility to harness that technology and help our students learn more effectively to keep up with this knowledge explosion. And perhaps in 10, 15 years, we're all going to be here at a new webinar, not thinking about knowledge acquisition, but knowledge management, that we'll have other devices because there's simply too much to know. But this is, I think, a relentless progression that we're headed towards.
Can I just add, I think Dr. Mohan has a question, is what's the nature of the questions for our readiness assessment? We use multiple choice questions. So in other words, we set 2 multiple choice questions, but our questions are based entirely on the concept to be applied in that classroom, in that session. So we use multiple choice questions. And Dr. Mohan also asked, how do we ensure that they engage with the material if they're not getting marks for the test? So for us, we explain to the students that the score they get for that test is a formative score. In other words, it gives them an idea, or gives the student an idea how well they're keeping up with the material, given that you were getting flipped classroom sessions every second day. So it gives the student an idea of, yes, I'm keeping up with the material, I am not falling behind. And that sort of information, that feedback information the students get about their own performance, it's what drives their own engagement with the test. Without the scoring feedback to the student has no information. Without taking the test, the student has no information about how prepared they are for a flipped classroom session. In many ways, that's the measure for driving their engagement with the pre-work before they come into the class.
And since we're discussing sort of platform support for these things, let me show you very briefly what it can look like in practice. And so it's a little less theoretical, just as an example, so I don't know if you can see my screen here. I'm getting a rotating.
There we go.
Great.
Good afternoon.
So,
one quick question to Dr. Raj, if there is a time. Good afternoon, Dr. Raj. I just want to ask, as you said that we do the readiness assurance test in the beginning of flipped classroom. But what if the students score very low in that readiness assurance test? So let's say the majority of the class, more than 50% of the class. So is there any strategies where we can motivate our students to come well prepared before we begin the flipped classroom in the classroom session?
So yeah, so that's one of the things that we discuss a lot with our faculty. I mean, you're asking about low scoring. We actually debate both sides of it. In other words, what if the students come in? There are 4 questions for a 1-hour session, 2 flipped classroom sessions, anatomy, physiology, and all the students get 100% in all of the questions. So now you've got a classroom that is totally prepared and a faculty that is like not knowing what do you do next. So the point is, if the students are scoring low, it actually gives instructors a rationale for the flipped classroom session. In other words, we now know, okay, this is where the gap is. This is what we need to address. Now, the problem, irrespective of where the problem lies, it doesn't matter because now you've got a chance to address that deficiency. In other words, what's the problem here? Is it an understanding? If we apply the concepts, do the students understand how to apply those concepts? And the flipped classroom allows you to repair a low score. It's a lot more challenging when there's a high score. What do you do with a high score? We still go ahead and we apply the concepts just to convince ourselves that the students are very, very, very well prepared for that session. Dr. Ian's asked a question about whether the pre-tests factor into the student's grade. We started off factoring it into the student's grade. It became a high stress activity for the students in the flipped classroom environment, which is not what our intention was. I mean, we want the students to learn, but we didn't want the students to think that the entire purpose for the flipped classroom was just to get a grade. So we've now made it a formative grade. In other words, it helps the students, and we score the students not for the grade they get, but for attending the flipped classroom session. So in other words, you can decide to come into flipped classroom and not take the readiness assurance if you don't want to. You'll get scored for attendance, but you won't get scored for the grade. So we reduced the stress factor for the assessment itself and made it part of the flipped classroom experience.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Az.
And I would add, formative testing is again very, very much science-based, science-backed, and hugely important. And increasingly, accrediting bodies are looking specifically for the formative part of the assessment process. So something very important to keep in mind. Your challenges sound very familiar, though. How do you get the students to realize the importance without adding the stress and the anxiety? And there's a question here about faculty resistance and training to use the platform. The platform is designed to be easy, but you're absolutely right. No matter how easy it is, most of us as clinicians and medical educators, this is new territory. And so there certainly Lecturio offers help. I'm happy to help share my experiences. It's very important that these kinds of things get introduced in an easy, incremental fashion, and that faculty know what they're taking on. We've kept quite a group for a long period of time. I don't know. It says we still have 100 folks here, and whether we don't want to keep people beyond other commitments. Any other?
Feel free to leave, of course.
Right.
I was just showing a little bit in parallel what things look like in practice. I'm just curious, Dr. Raj, do the faculty actually tailor the teaching unit then based on the pre-information, or is it just scoring? Because that's obviously one of the beautiful opportunities, I think, right?
So sorry, if I understood the question, you're asking if our faculty tailor the session to...
Yeah, based on the readiness assessments, kind of, showing what concepts are understood and less understood.
Yes, because I think without the readiness assurance, it just makes the flipped classroom another prepared session, which is not what we're trying to achieve. So remember, the faculty are the ones who set the readiness assurance tests. So they know what concepts they're testing. They know expect two possible outcomes, either a weak performance on that concept or very good performance on that concept. So you're prepared for the session based on two possibilities. That's what drives the design of your session for that day, for that particular topic.
Very helpful. Other comments or questions? So. Good. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, so you all sticking around for as long as you have. And I know for some of you, it's far later than it is for me here, 8 p.m. in Germany, obviously, or earlier for Dr. Raj and Dr. Horneffer. Let me just say thank you to both of you for preparing as much as you did for this, which is evident from the presentation and just how coordinated the two of you were taking all of us through it. So thank you so much. We hope this is overall beginning of an engagement and dialogue. We want to connect educators, help this kind of innovation, make it happen, make it easier, also ensure continuity with all the disruptions at the moment. And obviously I want to pass the last words to you. Maybe you did first, Dr. Raj, and then Dr. Horneffer as the host.
Yeah, so I just want to say, I want to thank everyone who's attended the webinar for one simple reason. Although what I've done is explain our experience for Flipped Classroom at CUSM, our experience has been shaped by all of the questions and all of the feedback that we've gotten from our students, from our faculty, and from participants at webinars like this. So in other words, each one of the questions that you have asked goes back to shape what we do so that we get to improve and enhance the learning experience for our students. What we have is not perfect. In my opinion, what we have will never be perfect, because every time we get asked a question, we refine those gaps that we think might exist in the experience. The other thing we've learned is that with three first-year classes in the last 3 years, we realized that learners are different. Collections of learners differ. So every year, what we thought worked last year suddenly doesn't seem to work again this year. So we're constantly having to redefine our methodology in order to achieve the same level of outcomes compared to the previous year. So that keeps us working in a sense and analyzing all the time, which is why our data collection mechanisms and process matter a lot for us. So I just want to thank everyone for contributing to that enrichment process for us at CSM by attending the webinar today. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Ettarh. And as I said, I was so pleased to, when you accepted my request to help share with everybody what you all have done at CUSM. It really is remarkable and noteworthy, and it's what I know I am trying to achieve. There are a number of questions about the recording, and yes, we'll send this recording out. It'll be part of our Re-envision series library. So if you did not make previous sessions, you can refer back to that. We will also be sending out a follow-up poll so that we can learn, what you would like to see in future webinars. We're all learning together, and my parting comments is let's think evidence-based and let's be open-minded to how we're going to do this and all be committed to make the process better. And if every one of us puts our best effort towards that goal, I think we will truly re-envision medical education, and importantly, we will have found a silver lining to the hugely challenging pandemic that will, that we are learning to deal with, and hopefully education will be given a huge boost. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Stefan and the whole Lecturio team for orchestrating the mailings and the particulars of the Zoom conference. And I look forward to hopefully having as many of you as possible in future webinars. And please let us know, what are the other burning issues? I've got I've got a few ideas myself, but please respond when you get the follow-up information with a recording, and give us ideas for the future as well. So
thank you,
with
Peter.
that,
And let me add thanks for Jackie and Daniel specifically, who did a lot of assisting here in preparation, contents, delivery, making sure you all have the access information and all of that. And without their support, it would not have been as smooth or high quality for us to build on.
excellent, absolutely.
So bye for now for everyone, and hopefully reach out to us anytime if you want to have some more dialogue here, have questions, etc. We're available. So take care.